All right, so a little bit of an explanation before we start this. I had grandiose plans for a unique assignment where we could do something of a digital gallery walk. And after exploring multiple ways of doing this and giving you guys access to each other's and waiting for people to finish under special schedules, there were just too many, to use a juggler's phrase, too many balls in the air that I couldn't deal with it. So I've decided to move on. You guys did an excellent job on those presentations. If I come up with a way where I can share them out with all of you and still maintain certain things that I have to, we'll be able to do that in the future. But right now, I want to just plow forward with Reconstruction. I don't have the time to that I would like to create a totally new assignment. So anyway, the Civil War ends and we enter a period known as Reconstruction. So again, the dates of the war, 1861 to 1865. So we're still in the 19th century. And as soon as the war ends, you are officially in Reconstruction. Some historians actually argue that Reconstruction started before the end of the war because those parts of the South, which had already pretty much given up, were starting to think about how the heck do we become one country again? Right? If you drive to Virginia, or if you drive to Georgia or Florida or Texas, any of these states, or fly there, you are still in the United States. But during the war, they seceded. These were nations or states that were part of a nation that was not our own. So we had to find a way to get from there to here, and Reconstruction is the way. So this, I have to say, is probably one of my all-time favorite history channels, Crash Course, and this is one of their better videos. It's 13 minutes long, but it's worth every second. The gentleman in it is almost as funny as I am, but he talks a little bit faster. So it's a bit of a trade-off. You definitely want to watch this at least once. If you're a fan of history, you're going to want to watch it again. He gives you a lot of really good information. I think you should start by watching this video and then dig back into this because he gives a great rundown of a lot of the things that are in this presentation. Okay, I'm obviously not going to play it now, but feel free to go back in and watch this. All right, so we start off with the 13th Amendment. Recall that amendments to our Constitution, the word amendment means to change. So the 13th Amendment prohibited slavery in the United States. So this is different than the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was given, it was an executive order given by Abraham Lincoln that officially ends slavery, done. But now we need to rewrite the Constitution to make sure that slavery is no longer allowed in the United States. Lincoln was a very forgiving individual, and so much so we're going to see even by his choice of vice president for his second term, he did something we don't really see these days. He chose a different vice president, more on that later, for his second term. But you could see he wanted to make it easy for southern states to rejoin the Union, right? It's kind of like if you and a sibling are fighting and it's like a really bad fight and one sibling is just kind of like, you know what, let's pretend that didn't happen. So Lincoln wasn't quite that conciliatory. He wasn't quite trying to pretend it didn't happen, but he's given them a really easy out. He says, look, if 1/10 of the population declares loyal to the Union, basically says, sorry, we're back, we're members of the United States of America, and your state has to approve the 13th Amendment. You do those two things, you can come back in. But the thing is, Lincoln didn't live for that long. He died within a month of the end of the Civil War. And his vice president, who was not the vice president, a guy by the name of Hannibal Hamlin for the entirety of the war, this guy named Andrew Johnson, who's actually a Democrat from Tennessee. So we'll learn more about Johnson in a second. Lincoln is obviously assassinated. We covered that in the previous presentation, so you can take a look at that. It is traditionally taught as part of the Civil War. I think just because of the human desire for narrative, it feels like part of the finish, right? Feels like the end of that season and not the beginning of this season, to use a TV show analogy. All right, the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen, referring to a name actually taken by a lot of former slaves at the time, quite literally is a person who has been freed. And it was created to help former slaves adjust to their new lives. It helped provide food, clothing, shelter, schools, and a bunch of other things. Legal assistance. There is a huge community tradition that grows out of this. Churches are formed. Universities come from this. The Freedmen's Bureau is a huge, huge movement that takes place across the entire South with help from the North. And you can see one of the first things here is chose new names. Slaves did not have last names frequently. And if they did, a lot of times they would have the last name of the person who had owned them, or the name of the plantation on which they worked, or even something derogatory or mimicking. So they were given a chance, right? Imagine being a slave, being given a name you had no love for and was meant to demean you. You could choose your new name. And some of those names you see, a lot of them chose names of famous Americans. Jefferson, Washington, believing that those names would make them part of the American tradition, which they were. They were a huge part of the American tradition. A lot of them took names like Freeman, different things like that. So they were able to find their families. Remember, in those DBQs, we wrote about what were slaves unable to do? How were their human rights violated? They built churches. They learned to read and write, really becoming part of this. Literacy is a huge push. And they became sharecroppers. We're going to cover sharecropping in a second, but if you go back and watch that video, he does a great job of demonstrating what sharecropping is. And unfortunately, how it is not very different from slavery. It's different in name, but it turns into a sort of indentured servitude. So during Reconstruction, many African-American men ran for public office and won. Over 2,000 of them. 400 of them held federal office. This was a literal light switch change, but people don't change their points of view that quickly. You can imagine white Southerners who just spent 4 years fighting a war to have slavery and now being told that the new governor of Louisiana is a black man would not sit very well with them. So you have to kind of keep in mind that these are real people, right? We like to think of history as stories, but these are real people living this. All right, sharecropping. It was a system in which landowners rented land in return for a portion of the farmer's crop. It's economic, so it's people, money, government, right? But we want to think a little bit about how this actually worked. So basically, I'm a rich white landowner in the South. I own all of this land, and I used to have slaves that farmed it, but now I'm not allowed to have slaves. So what do? I'm going to give former slaves, quote unquote, a house, a place to live on my land. And in return for that, they're going to get a share of the crop, but they have to work the crop. And I'm going to offer them by loaning, usually loaning at exorbitant rates, seeds, tools, food, clothing, anything else they needed. Now think about this. You were a slave. You don't have a lot of options, right? You don't have a college degree. You might not even be able to read. Forget a college degree. So what kind of job opportunities do you have in 1865? Not a lot. You used to get scraps, but that was some food. Now you're not getting anything. So you turn into a sharecropper. You take the opportunity, you live in this house, you farm this land because farming and working on a farm is the only thing you really know. And these former masters now become kind of like your boss, but it's not a direct money and payment situation. You probably live miles and miles away from anywhere that you can go that you would be able to purchase things with real money. So you end up back in a system that gets you back to this. And the systems were worked in such a way that you were never able to save enough money. In fact, it was hard for many sharecroppers to break even. Sharecroppers were often freedmen who remained dependent on landowners because they were overcharged for goods. One of the things that really caused resentment among whites in the South, and I don't exactly feel particularly bad for them in comparison to slaves, was the fact that poor whites had to become sharecroppers as well. And when they viewed themselves on par with black people, it became a huge point of wounded pride, which would serve to inflame certain feelings in the South that had unfortunately, to this day, still exist, but existed in much worse and vicious forms back then. All right, Andrew Johnson is the 17th president of the United States, the first president of the United States to be impeached. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln is president. When he's elected president in 1860, or becomes president in 1860, his vice president is a guy from Maine by the name of Hannibal Hamlin, a fellow Republican. Over 4 years later, Lincoln decides he's going to actually hold this election. He says, the people of the United States need to vote for president. It's a landslide victory. But what does he want to do? He wants to show that he's looking to be part of a united states, right? Which is literally the name, but he wants to bring in this Union Party. And he drops Hannibal Hamlin from the ticket, a fellow Republican from Maine who's not going to bring any Southerners. He picks Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson is the only Southerner who served in the Senate or in national office that did not resign his office with the United States Congress and stayed with the Union. So he is from Tennessee. He was born in North Carolina, I believe. He was from Tennessee and ends up serving alongside Union officials Now, don't get me wrong. He was a racist. He supported a lot of things that the Confederacy supported, except for the fact that he did not want to leave the Union. So a pro-Union Democrat, perfect choice to reunite. Because now Abraham Lincoln, during the election of 1864, is able to say, hey, look, I got this guy. He's from the South, just like you. I'm willing to work with you. It's me, a Northern Republican, and him, a Southern Democrat. We're going to fix the country. Vote for Lincoln. And they win. Within months, Lincoln is dead and Andrew Johnson becomes the president after embarrassing himself at his impeachment. Not at his impeachment, at his inauguration, at the inauguration of Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. So an interesting point in history. You could see honest conviction is my courage. The Constitution is my guide. He kind of fits in with like a Southerner from the Revolutionary period. He has a lot of similar feelings to what what Jefferson espoused. An interesting guy. There's a 60-second president coming up. I advise you to watch it. He pardons Confederate leaders and soldiers. He is much nicer to the Confederacy than he is to slaves. He even lets them go on writing these things called black codes, which are basically laws. Now, it becomes a legal distinction. So the law is something that does not allow for slavery, but you can write a lot of other laws that can get in the way of somebody's life. So these were laws that expressly prohibited blacks from doing certain things. And it was basically like taking the slavery playbook and replacing the words, and I believe I'm actually stealing a phrase from the gentleman from the 13-minute video, replacing the word slave with black person. Black people were not allowed to work without the permission of a white person. Black people were not allowed to be in the company of a white person without certain things. These were very restrictive laws and knocked down things like voting. You definitely couldn't marry someone of a different race. So definitely not something. This is our second phase of Reconstruction now. We had Lincolnian presidential Reconstruction, which lasted for about a month. And then we have now Johnson's presidential Reconstruction. He actually vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but as the gentleman in the Crash Course in History tells you, the United States Congress got together and did something they had never done before in nearly 100 years of being a Congress, and they overrode the president's veto, something in the Constitution. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866 passes, but not with Andrew Johnson's help. There have been vetoes overridden since. And this is the 60-second president that I highly advise you to watch. And now we dig a little bit more into the Black Codes and the 15th Amendment. Black Codes were laws, as we said, passed by Southern states to prevent freedmen from voting, traveling, or doing certain kinds of work, and basically force them back into the same role they were in slavery. So the South has kind of reacted to the end of the Civil War with a legal distinction. Sure, we can't have slavery anymore. Sure, we can't be our own country, but we're going to create these complex legal loopholes that don't let black people do really anything. Now, this, as you can imagine, if you were a black person in the South and you were able to, you do what? Well, you leave if you can. And in this time period, over the next 50 years, we actually see millions of black folks leave the South and go to the North. And where do they go? They go to the cities in the North because that's where there are jobs. So we see this huge influx of African Americans from the 1860s onward. And it really picks up as we get closer to the 20th century.